I'd like to start with the simple and kind of tragic fact that for the last 18 years, we have continuously been at war. And in fact, we have expanded the number of wars. We've added, Libya, we've added Syria. Now we're collaborating with the Saudis in Yemen. If we want to stop stupid wars, to use the phrase that Trump used on the campaign trail that, frankly, I think got him a lot of votes. I think a lot of people, agree that many of these were, he came right out and said George W. Bush lied us into a war. He said that on the campaign trail. I think it's one of the reasons why he ate Jeb Bush's lunch. Because, Americans know this, Republicans and Democrats, they know that George W. Bush is a war criminal who lied us into a war and should have been prosecuted for it. Actually, Dick Cheney seems to be the major force behind that. And what happened to him? Well, he Halliburton was failing. It was on the edge of bankruptcy. Halliburton is now worth billions. And his weird daughter is now in the U.S. House of Representatives. So, or the Senate or something. Did she run for the Senate successfully? One or the other. Anyhow, it's not something high on my list to keep track of the Cheney family. In fact, it makes me rather nauseous. But nonetheless, I think if we want to stop stupid wars, and if you have a better way to stop stupid wars than this, let me know. But I think to stop stupid wars, we need to return to the draft. Now, not the full-blown draft like we had during the Vietnam era, where it's like you go into the military or nothing. But, now you've got Trump threatening wars in Iran and Venezuela, and there is not widespread public outrage about this. Why? Because widespread across the, fewer than 1%, I believe, maybe 2% at the most, of American families actually have a family member who's in the military. And that was certainly not the case in the 60s and 70s. It was certainly not the case in the 1940s during World War II. It certainly was not the case during World War I. It certainly wasn't the case during the Civil War. When you have a draft, suddenly the American populace says, oh, you want to go to war with Iran? Think twice, buddy. You want to go to war with Venezuela? I mean, if our children had to participate in wars, or if the young people who are listening to me right now, if you're under, 26, I think is was the top of the draft age during the Vietnam War, would you be all that enthusiastic about Trump's, saber rattling? But instead, we now have an army that's made up either of people trying to escape poverty, people trying to figure out how to get to college, or people who have, a long military tradition in their families, and I honor that. There's nothing wrong with that at all, except that we've got this kind of perverse incentive built into the military that, the normal process of rising through the ranks, which also includes not only increasing your rank, but also your pay, and thus even your pension. That normal process of rising through the ranks is rather slow when there's not a war going on. But if there is a war going on and you can get deployed to a war zone, boom, you can rise up through the ranks very quickly. And so, where is the incentive not to have wars? And the other consequence of this is that you end up with a military that's missing the diversity of the American people. It is, made up largely of people either with a gung-ho military family background attitude, or people who are trying to escape poverty or trying to at least make it through, get a GI Bill to go to college. And that doesn't necessarily give you the kind of diversity that you see in the military and by diversity, I'm talking about diversity of opinion as much as, racial or national ancestry diversity of politics. I mean, can you imagine, a group of soldiers wearing Donald Trump badges stitched onto their uniforms if the military truly represented the American populace? I can't. Maybe I'm missing something, but I just can't. But, the military is largely missing that diversity, which is why 18 years of continuous warfare has not become a huge political issue. Well, now Deval Patrick and General Stanley McChrystal, and I met McChrystal at a Talkers Magazine event, the talk radio industry event, back must have been 2005 or thereabouts, I think. it was, fairly early on in the Afghanistan war, and he had just come back from Afghanistan. And I said, General, what's your take on what's going on there? And he said to me, we will not be able to kill our way out of this war. And he made another point to somebody else who was talking to him that the war only took a month or so. The war was over. What was then going on, it was an occupation. And that's what we've been doing for 18 years is, low-level conflict in an occupation. It's what the British did with us. And, generally speaking, people don't like their countries to be occupied. So anyhow, Deval Patrick and General McChrystal have proposed a national service program. Now, my proposal for a national service program would say, okay, you can, after you get out of high school, you spend a year serving your country. You can spend that year in the military, or you can spend that year volunteering in a hospital or joining, Service for America, one of these national service programs. Habitat for Humanity, building houses for poor people, low-income people. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you could volunteer. I would eliminate religious organizations from this because I don't think you want somebody volunteering at a mega church to help raise money for the pastor's new $20 million jet. But outside of that, nonprofit organizations or military service, your choice. And at the end of that year, you've got college all the way to an MD or PhD, or trade school, all the way to an apprenticeship and a good solid job in a union shop for free. In fact, maybe even we could do like Denmark and give people a small stipend to help pay for housing and books. In my humble opinion, it's time to institute a national service program. I would call it that. I wouldn't call it a draft, but I would make it mandatory. And, you have your choice. There's also, with free college or trade school at the end of this, there's also a psychological reason for this. One of the things that we know from, and this goes back to the days of Sigmund Freud. One of the things that we know is that there are these developmental stages that kids go through. One of the reasons that, the terrible twos are as terrible as they are is that, kids are starting to create an identity of themselves as being independent from mom. This is typically the time that they stop breastfeeding. It's the time they start actually eating solid food. It's the time that they start figuring out that they can manipulate the world rather than simply being part of the manipulated. That's the terrible twos. Then you see the next time that kids go through a major separation tends to be around adolescence, around puberty. And that's the point at which they're actually shifting internally. They're shifting the groups with which they affiliate. Instead of boys always hanging out with boys, they start wanting to hang out with girls. And instead of girls always hanging out with girls, they start wanting to hang out with boys. And of course, everything in between, without getting into a long discussion about, gender and identity and all that. But you get the point. There's this second kind of shift that happens right around puberty, and it's hormone driven by and large. And then there's a third shift that happens typically within 5 years of that second shift, and you see this in kids that are somewhere between 13 or 14, all the way up to 18 or 19. Somewhere during that period of time, they tend to get into conflict with their own parents. And parents will say, oh, yeah, I don't even know my kid anymore. Who is this monster who came living in my house? It looks just like my son or daughter, but I don't know who this person is. Well, it turns out what's going on, and this is a normal and healthy developmental phase. This is when the child is going from being a member of and dependent on the family to being to having an independent identity out in the world, which is absolutely a necessary transitional stage to the next process where they might find a life partner, or they go off and start a job or a career, and they begin basically becoming an adult. And that third stage, that big stage, that developmental stage is, a major life transition. We religiously, and these are religions that go back thousands of years. In Catholicism, it's confirmation. In Judaism, it's bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah. I'm sure that there's a parallel in Islam and in Hinduism and in Buddhism. I'm just not familiar with the titles, with the names. And this is this rite of passage. Well, for us in American culture, the closest that we have to that rite of passage is graduating from high school, which is really not that big a deal. I mean, there was a time when it might have been a bigger deal, but really, a year of national service where you actually leave home and you go off to some other part of the country and build houses, or go off and join the Air Force or the Army for a year or whatever it may be. That's a healthy psychological thing. On the back end of that, when you're done with that, you're now an adult. And so there's a psychological reason for this, there's a cultural reason for this, there's a military reason for this, there's a political reason for this. It strengthens our country. We need volunteers, we need people helping out, and what a great time in your life to be out there learning, carpentry, building houses, or learning, what it's like inside a hospital as you're trying to decide what kind of career you want to go into, and you volunteer in a hospital. Oh, gee, I think I'll go into medicine. Or you volunteer, with NASA or something, and hey, I think I'll go into the space program and be an astronaut. Whatever it may be, I think this is a good idea. Now, that said, I'm way past draft age, and I'll be the first to acknowledge that. And I was pretty pissed off about the draft back when I was of draft age. But there was no non-military option back then, and there was a war going on that we had no say in and we could not vote about. Now 18-year-olds can vote.